everybody. We're about to get started. You're fine. Welcome to everyone that's here in person, and welcome to everyone that's joining us on the live stream. As I put into the chat, when we have time for our Q&A. Looks like that one's on. Yeah, can you silence that one?
Yeah.
Great. When we get to our Q&A, we're going to take questions from folks that are here, and we'll also take questions from folks that are on the live stream as well. So those can be entered into the chat. So without further ado, Sebastian Gomes is the executive editor for audio and video at America Magazine, the Jesuit Review. In that role, he oversees all of the podcast and video productions at America. Notably, he wrote and directed their first feature documentary, People of God, How Catholic Parish Life is Changing in the United States, which included a segment on St. Cecilia. For the past 2 Octobers, Sebastian was at the Vatican covering the global gatherings of the Synod on Synodality. And he's here to speak to us about the assembly that just concluded a few weeks ago. So welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thanks, everybody, for joining us on the live stream. I wasn't looking over your shoulder, Nicole. I was just trying to get close so that we would pick you up on the microphones, just so people are known. Okay, so as Nicole mentioned, I was just recently back from Rome. I was there for the second assembly of the Synod on Synodality, which, is a month-long meeting. It's part of a much bigger process that's been going on now for 3 years, in which representatives from the churches around the world, including bishops, priests, lay people, men and women religious, have been gathering to discuss synodality, what is it, and why it's very important for the future of the life and mission of the church. I say part 2 here because it's the second part of the Synod on Synodality, but also the second time I was here. If you go back far enough in the log of the St. Cecilia YouTube channel, you'll see about a year ago I was here talking about the first assembly and what it meant for us, but now we have concluded part 2. And this was really intentional on Pope Francis's part, because when he starts a particular process or he wants the church to engage with a particular question, he's very conscious of the need for time and space to let things mature. It's not enough to have a single encounter and come up with the conclusive dictates or whatever that are going to lead us into the future. He really needs the process. He wants the process to mature. He wants people to get to know each other. One of the phrases we've heard through this whole process is how affective collegiality precedes effective collegiality. In other words, you have to be friends, you have to know each other, you have to be in relationship before some really serious things can be done. So the second gathering, you see in this photo here, there were 368 participants, 272 of which were bishops, 96 lay people, priests, deacons, men and women religious, and they could all vote in this particular synod of bishops. Even the people who were not bishops, they could also vote. There were also 16 fraternal delegates. Those are delegates from other Christian churches. So a big theme, and I'm going to touch on this briefly in a little bit, is ecumenism through this whole process, the work toward Christian unity. Francis is very serious about that and serious about the Catholic Church playing a leadership role in bringing the Christian churches together in the 21st century. So what they were all doing, here, this is a picture at the end of the Synod when everybody was happy that they came up with a final document. But for the entire month of October, again, they were sitting at 36 different round tables. They were using this methodology that we're now all a little bit familiar with, called conversation in the spirit, in which everybody gets an equal amount of say around the table. So you have 10 to 12 people around a table, and they're talking about a particular topic related to synodality. Everybody gets equal time to share. There's a lot of listening. There's a lot of pauses for prayer. So this is the methodology that they've used last year and again this year. And the topic, of course, is what it means to be a synodal church. There were some changes to the methodology this year compared to last year, but I'm not going to touch on those because there's lots that we need to get to. They were very long days, very long sessions, a lot of listening. The delegates were, again, exhausted after this month. But it's a lot of work. Doing this is a lot of work. Listening for this long is a lot of work. So just want to recognize that. So I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. I don't want to do a play-by-play of what happened through the month as a kind of a recap, but I'm going to briefly touch on a few key moments during the Synod that I think tell a deeper story of the whole evolution and the maturation of the Synod and of synodality on the whole. And then we'll look at I just want to highlight a couple things from the final document, which is the product that the Synod came up with at the end. They were having all of these conversations with the goal of eventually coming up with a document that would be succinct, concrete, direct expression of their conversations, and it would be something that they could give the universal church to say, here's the fruit of what we've been living these past 3 years, now let's go and implement it. And then in particular, I am going to touch on what happened around the topic, the conversations of the topic of women and the diaconate, which I think, in my opinion, is probably one of the most mature questions or discernments that are happening in the church today. And because of that, it sort of naturally becomes a focal point when we're having a conversation about synodality, because it's kind of a microcosm or an example through which we can engage and judge how we're being synodal around a very serious question of which there's a lot of debate and different opinions on. And then, as Nicole said, we'll open it up for questions and comments. We're all part of the synodal church, so we all have a voice at the table. So I welcome whatever you'd like to share. Let me see here. I mentioned the final document. We love documents in the church, don't we? That's always like the end thing that we produce. But I want to just highlight the fact that there was enormous anticipation for this one, because it felt like something different. This wasn't just a synod the way that synods had been operating since the end of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Francis, one of the big changes, for example, I mentioned is that people who were not bishops had a vote this time. So lay people like you or I, who could have been at the synod, would have had a vote. And that's significant for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later. But everybody was anticipating this. Oh, I should say too, the other reason why there was such anticipation is because of the global consultation that took place, right? We're now 3 years into this whole thing, but if you remember 3 years ago when the whole thing was launched, there were listening sessions and spaces for all of us to share what we felt were the big issues facing the Catholic Church today, how we understand ourselves, what synodality means to us, the degree to which we feel like we can participate in structures and processes in the church, and the degree to which we feel like we can't, and and how we need to hold each other accountable to try to live the mission of the church today. So all of these things, we're building toward this anticipation because everybody had great expectations of what would come from this. So what would the Synod say? What would they demand reforms, for example? Would they say something meaningful and concrete that would make an impact on people like us that live in a parish? Would it disappoint in some ways, right? So the expectation for this final document was significant. So in light of that, I just want to offer a kind of an image that we can use as a framework for receiving the document. So just keep this in mind as we go through our presentation tonight. And it comes from one of the bishops from the United States, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, who's the Archbishop of Chicago. And after this assembly, he did an interview with us. And one of the things he said was, and this is a quote, "The Synod's final document is not a landing strip, it's a launching pad. We are just beginning. We have no idea how this is going to unfold. This is why this is historic." So this image of the Synod's final document as a launching pad rather than a landing strip is, I think, a good image to use for this particular moment that we find ourselves in as we're receiving the final document from the Synod. So I'm going to start here with something from the final document, then we'll get into some of the key moments that took place over the course of the month. So we finally have a definition of synodality, and this maybe seems like a meager accomplishment, but there was a lot of pressure on the Synod to do this because a big criticism of this whole Synod process so far, it's been kind of twofold. One is that synodality is just this thing that we feel, where we're all sitting around and we all get to kind of say what we think, and then who knows, Are we really capable of making a difficult decision through this process? Does it give us the tools, and the insight and the confidence to be able to sit at the table, make a difficult decision together, and then move forward together as a church? That, to this point, has been unclear. We don't know. So there are people who are, when you talk about how great synodality is, yes, but does it actually make a difference for us? And on the other side, there's been a lot of criticism about synodality because it's a little bit amorphous. Some people who are a little bit afraid of this whole process and afraid of some of the conversations that have, come up through the process believe that, well, this is a whole ploy for some people who have very particular agendas to ram them through because you can't really define synodality, therefore, it leaves all these avenues for people to sneak in their own agendas. So there's been criticism of that as well, of synodality in that regard as well. So we finally have the definition. I'll read it through here. We're not going to go through it in depth, but I would just say there's a lot to unpack here. And it's probably worth talking about. So if you have questions or comments after we read through it together, just make some notes and feel free to submit them. So this is what synodality is. We now know. Walking together of Christians with Christ and towards God's kingdom in union with all of humanity. Oriented toward mission, synodality involves gathering at all levels of the church for mutual listening, dialogue, and community discernment. It also involves reaching consensus as an expression of Christ rendering himself present, who is alive in the Spirit. Furthermore, it consists in reaching decisions according to a differentiated understanding of co-responsibility. Along these lines, we can understand better what it means to say that synodality is a constitutive dimension of the church. In simple and concise terms, synodality is a path of spiritual renewal and of structural reform that enables the church to be more participatory and missionary so that it can walk with every man and woman radiating the light of Christ. I just want to highlight here, this is just a picture of the table of contents of the final document, and if you look carefully, there's a word that I've highlighted throughout, which is conversion. This is a major theme of the entire synodal process. And if we think about what conversion means, going back to our scripture courses 101, but in the tradition, it really means changing your mind, right? Changing your attitude, changing your outlook on life. The way that we relate to each other, the way we act, the way that we make decisions. So, as I mentioned before, there's been some criticism because synodality maybe wasn't defined. It's taken us a long time, 3 years so far, to kind of really get into it and get to this point where we have a final document. But part of that is because it takes a long time as well to convert. And so we're not even at the end here. This goes back to what Cardinal Supich said. It's not a landing pad or a landing strip, but a launching pad, right? That conversion in the church is, just like conversion in each of us takes a while. It's not something that you just snap your fingers and it happens. It's not a decision that you make and then you move forward. But this is central to the whole journey. Okay, so a couple important moments. Speaking of conversion, the beginning of this synod assembly started in a unique way. It started with a penitential liturgy. So this is a picture of Pope Francis with some of the cardinals that you see there in St. Peter's Basilica. And in this penitential liturgy, 7 cardinals stood up and read requests for forgiveness that the Pope said that he wrote because, quote, it was necessary to call our main sins by name. And so the cardinals read out sins against peace, sins against creation, sins against indigenous populations, against migrants, sins of abuse, sins against women, family, and young people, sins of using doctrine as stones to be hurled, sins against poverty, sins against synodality, or a lack of listening, communion, and participation of everyone. So naming some key things. Again, this is connected to the theme of conversion, but a big part of conversion is also repentance and acknowledging of where we've gone wrong. And so Francis was insisted that this particular assembly start with naming some of these things. In his address during this service, the Pope said, "How could we be credible in our mission if we do not acknowledge our mistakes and stoop to heal the wounds we have caused by our sins?" So trying to be very honest right from the beginning. So a synod begins with a lot of opening addresses, some of them logistical, some of them thematic, and the Pope usually does a little introductory speech himself, and I want to just highlight something that he said because it's very important. Remember I said this is the first synod where non-bishops were able to be full voting members. Because what happens at the synod is you have this conversation for a month, then a final document is being drafted in the meantime about what's been talked about. They're formulated in paragraphs, and then at the end of the synod votes paragraph by paragraph to approve or not to approve the text. So in this synod, as last year, the members who are not bishops got to vote on that text, which is very significant. And Francis made this point in his opening address at this synod, which is important, I think, for historical reasons, and I just want to quote it here. He justified his decision to do that, to include non-bishops as voting members. And he said, "In choosing to convene as full members a significant number of lay and consecrated persons, men and women, deacons, priests, developing what was already in part envisaged from previous assemblies, I acted in continuity with the understanding of the exercise of episcopal ministry set forth by the Second Vatican Council. The bishop, the principal and visible foundation of unity in each particular church, cannot carry out his ministry except within the people of God and with the people of God, preceding, standing in the midst of, and following that portion of God's people entrusted to his care. This inclusive understanding of the episcopal ministry is meant to be clearly seen." So I only highlight this to make a historical and important theological point, which is the Pope has made this decision to allow people who are not bishops to participate and vote in a synod of bishops because he feels that this is an authentic expression of the theology that the bishops at Vatican II in the 1960s articulated, right? So a lot of people will look at what Francis is doing with synodality and see it as a move away from tradition. It's something novel. But it's actually the opposite. It's actually a move toward tradition in the sense that what the Vatican Council in the 1960s, the bishops said there, is an authentic expression of the tradition. And this type of synodal operating as a church is built into what the bishops said in the 1960s. So a really important historical and theological point to make there. So the next significant moment I want to highlight is the ecumenical vigil that took place on October 11th. So speaking of Vatican II, ecumenism, or the work of Christian unity, was one of the main goals of Vatican II. I mean, reform of the church and the updating of the church was one thing. Ecumenism was the second goal. I mentioned that there were 16 fraternal delegates, other Christian delegates at this synod this year. That was up from 12 last year, so it increased there. The prayer service, October 11th, is the anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council in 1962, so that was significant. And it was held in the square of the Christian proto-martyrs, just next to the Synod Hall, and like kind of in between the Synod Hall and St. Peter's Basilica. And this historically is the place where we believe Peter and the other first martyrs in Rome were killed, or other martyrs from Rome were killed. So a very significant moment. And this prayer service included quotes from the documents of the Second Vatican Council. I'd never heard some of the quotes from those documents read in a liturgical setting, but it was quite extraordinary. It was quite beautiful. And I highlight this only to say, throughout this entire month, when there was a public-facing event about the synod, whether it was press briefings, the synod held a couple of what are called theological forums where theologians could kind of talk about the theological implications of synodality and how it was evolving. There were a number of these public-facing events. The vigil, Vatican II was like front and center the whole time. So that was clearly very intentional, that the Pope sees this development of synodality as part of the ongoing implementation of Vatican II. And it has some practical applications. Like if you read closely in the final document, I mean, first of all, the document says that ecumenism, the work of Christian unity, is fundamental to synodality. So in other words, you cannot become a synodal church unless you are actively working for Christian unity, accomplishing Christian unity. And if you, even more kind of granularly, if you say, okay, in our community, we have a decision to make, we're going to do this in a synodal way, what would it look like to invite members of other Christian churches into that discernment process? Like maybe that's something that could come out of this. This is another picture from the ecumenical visual. Very powerful moment. Okay, women's participation and study group 5. This is kind of a shameless plug, but this question of women in the diaconate has been fascinating for me to watch, because this is a little screenshot of a video that I've produced in the last couple months that's really a comprehensive explainer on this whole question of women deacons, the history of it, the arguments for and against, the state of the question in the church today. And the reason why we at America chose to do a video that was, quite a significant investment of resources to try to put out is because this question of women deacons is, in my view, as I said, one of the most mature questions in the church today. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we'll get into some of them, I suppose. But the point is, I don't want to say it's a litmus test, because it's not, of synodality. But it's a perfect example of a question where there's different opinions. It's a very serious question. It's a question that's raised by people all across the world, not just in North America or Europe. And so it has to be dealt with. And we don't know where it's going to lead. We don't know if women deacons will be restored or not. We know historically that there were women deacons. We have evidence of their ordinations. We have evidence of their names and that some of the different things that they did. But for 800 years we haven't had them. So it's a question now that's facing the church. That's up to the discernment of the church to decide if it wants to restore them or not. Okay, so study group 5. This is a picture of Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, who's the prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, right? So the Pope's, he's a theologian from Argentina, very close to the Pope's hand-selected doctrinal czar, so to speak. So why are we bringing this up, study group 5? There are 10 study groups as part of this synodal process that are looking at very particular questions that Catholics around the world and the Synod last year raised that need to be dealt with. And in February, the Pope decided to take these 10 very kind of specific questions and send them to study groups, to a group of, their makeup is, they're all a little bit different, but in giving it to experts who can really kind of break down the fundamentals of the question and try to come up with an answer to them. So I'll read you some of them here just so you get a sense of what I'm talking about. So there's one, some aspects of the relationship between the Eastern Catholic churches and the Latin Church. So the relationship between the 22 or 23 Eastern churches and the Latin Church. Listening to the cry of the poor. The mission in the digital environment. So what do we do with the digital world? Reform and revision of the Ratio Fundamentalis Institutionis, Sacerdotalis. So that's into a missionary perspective. So the formation of priests in a missionary synodal perspective. What does that look like? The role of the papal nuncios or papal kind of ambassadors that live in different countries, and how do we kind of renew them in a missionary synodal perspective? And then study group 5, the topic is some theological and canonical matters regarding specific ministerial forms. And this comes out of the Synod last year, which talked very directly about the participation and places of leadership and authority for women in the church. And specifically, what kinds of ministry are open to women and what are not. And the question of women deacons was asked to be continued to be studied. So the Pope in February, as I said, created these specific study groups to tackle some of those topics. They have a mandate to basically respond to some of these questions by June 2025. So some people interpreted this in February as the Pope taking these questions away from the Synod, which is kind of, could be interpreted as a little bit of a affront to the Synod, right? It's not up to you. I want you to talk about synodality, not these very particular questions. But there's another way of looking at it, which is that the Pope acknowledged that these were such serious questions that we need to get to the bottom of them, and we need to make decisions about them. And therefore, we're going to form these study groups to do that. So the Synod, in this one that just ended, the beginning of October, all of these groups, or representatives from these 10 study groups, gave a little update, a little status report of how their work was going. And there was I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to focus on study group 5, which is this question related to women. And there was a ton of anticipation for that, right? Because, as I mentioned, the 2023 Synod Assembly asked that women deacons continue to be studied. So this topic was given to the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is led by Cardinal Fernandez. And it's, anticipation, as I mentioned, not only because of the question of women deacons, but because the question of women's participation in the church and roles in the church more broadly is clearly one of the main themes, if not the main theme, of this entire synod. It came from every corner of the world, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this regard, so a lot of anticipation. So Cardinal Fernandez gives his update, and basically what he says in his update is that the Dicastery is working on a new document that is broader than the study group topic on the, quote, pressing issue of women's participation in the life and leadership of the church. And he tells the synod some of the topics that they're studying in this broader exploration. And I think they're quite interesting, so I'll just read you here what he said. He said, we're looking at the specificity of sacramental power. So what does sacramental power mean? In other words, like a priest is ordained, he can administer the sacraments. What is the level of power or authority that's associated with that particular ministry? He also said they're looking at the relationship between sacramental power and the ecclesial ministries needed for the care and growth of God's holy people with a view to mission. So what is the relationship between sacramental power and actual care and leadership of communities? I don't know. Maybe they're studying this. The origin of ministries, so they're going back into the history of these ministries and what the church has believed about them. The charismatic dimension of the life of the church, ecclesial functions and... Is that somebody? Thank you. Ecclesial functions and ministries that do not require the sacrament of holy orders. So what do ministries look like that don't require ordination? And holy orders as a commitment to service. And then lastly, the problems arising from an erroneous conception of ecclesial authority. So he's sort of saying, he's acknowledging that there are erroneous conceptions of ecclesial authority. What are those, and how do we break these open a little bit more? So these are the things that, this is the broader scope of this document that Cardinal Fernandez says that he's working on, beyond just the question of women in the diaconate, but he says we are also looking at that. But about that question, he says in this update, quote, the dicastery judges that there is still no room for a positive decision by the magisterium regarding the access of women to the diaconate, understood as a degree of the sacrament of holy orders. In other words, women being able to be ordained as permanent deacons are ordained. The Holy Father himself, I'm still quoting Cardinal Fernandez, the Holy Father himself recently confirmed this consideration publicly. You may remember in April of this year, the Pope gave an interview with Nora O'Donnell of CBS, in which she asked him point blank, are you considering opening the diaconate to women? And he said no. So we sort of know where the Pope stands on the question. But this is important, and we're going to come back to it. So Cardinal Fernandez says the Holy Father himself has confirmed this consideration publicly. In any event, the dicastery judges that the opportunity to continue the work of in-depth study remains open. Okay, so that's his update at the beginning of the synod. Well, the updates that these study groups gave to the synod were not enough for the synod, and they made that opinion known. One reason, for example, is that the members who were making up the study group 5, looking at this question with Cardinal Fernandez, were not named. And that was the only study group where the cardinal, in this case, who's leading the study group, did not mention who else is on the commission working on the questions with him. So it wasn't clear at all who was part of the study group or how they were operating. And so the synod leadership, it's a different group of people, agreed to establish meetings between the synod delegates, all the participants, those 300 and some people that I mentioned at the beginning, and these specific study groups, the representatives of these study groups, a few weeks later. So that was scheduled for October 18th. So on October 18th, I don't know what the exact number is, but about 100 of the people who were at the synod show up to the meeting expecting to see Cardinal Fernandez to engage in a dialogue about some of these questions. He didn't show up. There were two kind of officials from the congregation, or the dicastery from the Doctrine of the Faith, but they were kind of low-level people. They were just there to kind of listen. They welcomed everybody. They were very polite and cordial. They handed out a piece of paper that had an email address on it and said, please submit your thoughts about, all the questions that we're studying to this email address. Well, needless to say, the 100 or so delegates that were there did not take that well. They sort of revolted in real time and said, this is totally unacceptable. You're not dealing with this in a synodal way at all, at least our understanding of synodality. When we come to a dialogue, we expect to have a dialogue with the people who are actually making the decisions here. So we expect Cardinal Fernandez or others who are at that level to be engaged with us on this question. And it was a fascinating, probably the most interesting, kind of fascinating moment through this entire month. Because what it showed was that the synod had, I'm using a word here from Austin Ivory, who's a famous commentator on Catholic things, who was at that actual meeting. He said the synod found some agency, right? So agency is a key word here. It kind of has matured to the point where this group of people now has the courage to hold the church, even the doctrinal czar, Cardinal Fernandez, accountable to the methodology that they've all promised to buy into. That's very significant, right? I've never seen something like that before, where a group of people shows up to the Vatican and demands accountability about some things like this. So that's very significant. At a press briefing later, actually one of the members of our team who was there covering it, my colleague Colleen Dully, she asked the people who were at the briefing if they thought that Study Group 5 was operating in a synodal way. And Sister Natalie Picard, who's one of the officials for the synod, said, I'm paraphrasing here, but even the Roman Curia has to learn how to be synodal. So there's an element here of the conversion needing to happen at all levels, right? It's not just all of us learning, I guess most of us here are lay people, I imagine, right? So us lay people kind of learning about our own baptismal call to be more engaged and more participatory and more confident and proactive in our leadership in the church, but also needs to be learned from the very highest levels. Okay, so Cardinal Fernandez was very apologetic, and he agreed to meet with the delegates a week later. So they showed up. They had a 90-minute meeting with him. It was a fascinating conversation. It was recorded. The audio of it was recorded and then later released. And we just published a transcript of that entire meeting. So if you really want to go into the weeds about how the Synod delegates engaged with Cardinal Fernandez on this question of women in the life of the church, you can read that entire transcript at America Magazine. I'm going to highlight a couple of things. One of the delegates, Father Arobator, who's a Jesuit and the dean of the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University, in that meeting, he asked Cardinal Fernandez what evidence there is, quote, that there is still no room for a positive decision by the magisterium regarding the access of women to the diaconate. In other words, what Cardinal Fernandez had said at the beginning of the synod, that we judge that there's still no room to make a positive decision, he said, what's the evidence for that? And he said he asked whether that was based on the confidential reports from the previous study commissions on women deacons. There had been 2 prior commissions that Pope Francis established in 2016 and 2020, I believe, to study this question in particular. And Father Arobator said, related to this question being mature or not, quote, "I like fruit. I eat a lot of fruit. And when I keep fruit to ripen and mature, I look for signs, the change in color, maybe the aroma, maybe the texture. And so my question is, what are those signs, those norms, those principles that we should be looking for, that you are looking for, Cardinal Fernandez, to really judge that, yes, now is the time that we can say that this is mature? Because if we don't have those principles and norms and signs, we could be doing this for the rest of our lives, right? In other words, pushing back a little bit to say, well, how do we know when a decision is mature or not? Who gets to say whether a decision is mature or not? Are we really listening in a way that is reflective of the state of the question around women deacons? And so, fascinating conversation. Cardinal Fernandez responded in this meeting, and he said, from the work of the 2 commissions on women deacons that I just mentioned, he said things are not absolutely clear. So those commissions were not in agreement. They didn't come to consensus about the question of women deacons, so he acknowledged that. And he said the comment that the question is not ripe, mature, he said, is the Pope's language, not mine. And that is why, this is Fernandez speaking, he, the Pope, does not want to close the issue of the diaconate. He says that we can still study with patience, without obsession, without haste. We can continue to study, and this is very important, but the Pope thinks that things are not yet mature. And this is Cardinal Fernandez still speaking. He also said, if you ask me my personal opinion, and I can give it as a theologian, I'm not speaking as the prefect, but as a theologian, I believe that the foundations for the no to the female diaconate are reasonable, but they are not sufficient. The reasons for the yes to women deacons are not enough to respond to the negative opinions. With this sincere opinion, no one is happy though, right? And then I'll just say, again, you should go to if you're really interested in going into the weeds in this whole question, please go and read the whole transcript, because it's fascinating, this meeting that took place between 100 delegates and Cardinal Fernandez. But Cardinal Fernandez concluded at the end of that 90-minute meeting, he concluded at the end of that conversation, that part of the conversation, I am very convinced that we cannot wait to take clear steps forward for an empowerment of women in the Church, distinguishing what is absolutely inseparable in holy orders from what is not. In other words, so going back to his initial kind of the work that he was doing beyond this question of women deacons, to say, what are the other questions, the much broader questions and inclusive questions about women's participation in the Church. And we cannot wait for the question of women deacons to do that work. So he's going to continue to do that work. And we know that the dicastery is actively working on a document that is going to be, we don't know when it's going to be published, but it will be published on the much broader implications of participation of women in the Church. So with this whole kind of episode, the Cardinal said that the study commission on women deacons will be reconvened and will continue to study the question. And as I said, the dicastery will move forward with its broader study of women's participation. And then at the end of that hour-and-a-half long meeting, the Cardinal said, I thought this was interesting. So he's speaking to the 100 delegates. What I felt today was very, very interesting to me. It is very important to open your mind to other ideas. I am not famous in the Church for being a closed medievalist. So you can rest assured that I have an open heart to see where the Holy Spirit takes us. Let's move on. Thank you very much. I thought that was interesting. Okay, so I'm going to just make a couple of brief quotes from the final document just to give you a flavor of what's in there, and then we can open it up for questions. So the final document is 155 paragraphs. It's about a little over 50 pages. Every paragraph received the necessary 2/3 vote to pass. So the entire thing was approved by the Synod. There were 155 delegates who were present voting. And I'll jump right to what it said about this question of women, because that's what we've focused on primarily tonight. So it's in paragraph 60, and the Synod said, this is quote, this assembly asks for full implementation of all the opportunities already provided for in canon law with regard to the role of women, particularly in those places where they remain underutilized. I might actually have this up here. Yeah, here we go. There is no reason or impediment that should prevent women from carrying out leadership roles in the church. What comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped. Additionally, the question of women's access to diaconal ministry remains open. This discernment needs to continue. So this paragraph, it was the paragraph with the most no votes, even though it did pass. So it was 258 to 97. Okay? But it did pass, right? I'm going to come back to this just in a second, just by way of conclusion, but let me point out a couple of other things. So just 3 things very quickly, some highlights. The Synod, I thought, offers, in the final document, some very practical steps and observations. So practical steps for discernment is the first one I want to highlight. And how it described this was tools for bringing about this change in culture. So the Synod is really calling at the end of this whole thing for a change in culture. So here's an example of how it's offering some steps for discernment. The steps of ecclesial discernment will differ depending on the various places, but based on the synodal experience, we have identified some elements for discernment which should be included. So in other words, here's how you do this in your own community. Clearly set out the objective of discernment and disseminate the information and the means for adequately understanding it. Giving sufficient time for prayerful preparation, for listening to the Word of God, and for reflection on the question. An inner disposition of freedom regarding one's own interests, both personal and as a group, and a commitment to the pursuit of the common good. Listening attentively and respectively to each person's voice, searching for the widest possible consensus which will emerge when our hearts burn within us, without hiding conflicts or searching for the lowest common denominator. The leaders of the process formulate the consensus in such a way that allows the participants to say whether they recognize themselves in it or not. So this is a kind of a practical guide for discerning serious questions as a community. So this is it's not rocket science, but what the Synod is saying is when you have a decision to be made as a church, the way of operating is not that we go to Father John or Bishop whoever and say, tell us what to do. We all sit around a table and we follow practical steps like this to engage in a very active, open discernment in which we all have a voice. That's the way we do things now, right? Here's another one I want to point out. So this is part of the paragraph 102, which is on creating structures of decision making. So the Synod says, it seems necessary to ensure, at the very least, the establishment everywhere of the following things in forms appropriate to different contexts. Effective functioning of finance councils. Effective involvement of the people of God, so all of us, in particular of the more competent members in pastoral and financial planning. Preparation and publication of an annual financial report, externally audited, demonstrating the transparency of how the temporal goods and financial resources of the church and its institutions are being managed. The preparation and publication of an annual report on the carrying out of the local church's mission. How are we doing related to our mission, including safeguarding initiatives and progress made in promoting the laity's access to positions of authority and to decision-making processes, specifying the proportion of men to women. In other words, starting to build in now processes for evaluation of whether or not we're actually doing this. So there's an element here of holding ourselves accountable, right? And number E, periodic evaluations of all the ministries and roles within the church. Okay, so what does it look like to evaluate our bishop? Well, now we can all do that. And here, number 92 is the last one I want to point out here, which related to bishops I think is very significant. The Synod says, in a synodal church, the authority of the bishop and of the Episcopal College and of the Bishop of Rome in regard to decision-taking is inviolable, as it is grounded in the hierarchical structure of the church established by Christ. Okay, so we know that. It serves unity and legitimate diversity. Such an exercise of authority, however, is not without limits. That exercise may not ignore a direction which emerges through proper discernment within a consultative process, especially if this is done by participatory bodies. So imagine a church in which we're all making decisions together, and in one of these processes, if a decision is made, the bishop is expected to follow that discernment. The bishop cannot say, "Thank you very much, I'm doing something else." It's very interesting how they're trying to put the scaffolding in place so that we all must participate in the mission of the church. They give at the beginning of the document the reasons for that. Because of our baptism, we are all equal in the church, and we have distinct roles, but we all have important roles, and we're all essential. And now in the latter parts of the document here, like number 10, whatever it is, 92, 102, they're building the scaffolding to ensure that we can hold ourselves accountable to that. So finally, at the end of the voting, the Pope thanked everyone and then said, in a rather historic decision, that he would not publish his own document on the Synod, which every Pope has done at the end of every Synod prior to this one, since the Second Vatican Council. Instead, he approved and adopted the Synod's final document as his own. And if you're a church news junkie, you know that today the Pope issued a note of accompaniment to this final document, which saying that this document is part of, quote, the ordinary magisterium of the successor of Peter, and that the local churches and their groupings are now called to implement in different contexts the authoritative directions contained in the document through discernment and decision-making processes foreseen by canon law and the document itself. So the Pope, this whole Synod process up to now, the anticipation of this final document and the Pope saying, I don't need to say anything else. We have spoken through this document, and I am one of the we. It's not the I who is separate from the we who gives you something else, right? Just a historical kind of to help you put this in historical kind of framework. When the Pope, it was May of 2023, so before the first session in Rome, 2023, he decided to. We've been talking a lot about how non-bishops got to vote in the Synod. He made that decision in May of 2023. Synods have always been consultative, right? So they're a gathering where everybody gets together and talks, and they offer their opinions to the Pope, and then the Pope takes that as kind of a consultation. But the Synod itself is not quote-unquote deliberative. In other words, it can't make the decision itself. It has to only give its decisions to the Pope, and then he decides. So keep that in mind. But when the Pope first announced that people who were not bishops would get to vote, I wrote an article just kind of analyzing this, and here's what I said. The synods are consultative, not deliberative bodies, yes. The final document of a synodal assembly is voted on and presented to the Pope for him to consider as he writes his own magisterial teaching document. However, with this decision to open voting to non-bishops, a fascinating possibility emerges. Canon Law number 343 states that since a synod of bishops is directly subject to the authority of the Pope, a Pope can, quote, endow it with deliberative power, in which case he ratifies the decisions of the synod. end quote. So now my own reflections on this. Should Pope Francis choose to do this, the Synod's final document participates in the ordinary magisterium of the successor of Peter, once it's been ratified and promulgated by him. In other words, the votes of non-bishop and non-ordained participants on the final document in a synod could hypothetically contribute directly to an official magisterial teaching document of the Roman Catholic Church. And that, to my knowledge, would truly be groundbreaking. End quote. So that was my reflection back in May of 2023, and here we are, and it just happened. So there are people who are not bishops who have just contributed to the development of the magisterium of the Catholic Church. That is really extraordinary. And so I'm inclined to agree with Cardinal Supich that, what's the quote? The Synod's final document is not a landing strip, but a launching pad. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and happy to engage with you all and with questions, comments, and whatever you'd like to share. Thank you. Yes, please.
What percentage of the final voters were bishops?
I think I got it here. So the question is, how many of the participants, how many were bishops? So there were officially 368 participants. I believe there were 355 people present for the final vote, because like some people have to go back to their diocese for something, or they get sick or whatever it is. I don't know what your question is, what's the percentage of that 355 who are bishops voting? I don't know.
I'm asking an approximate question.
So it's about a quarter of the people, a little over a quarter of the delegates were not bishops. Actually, it's an important question because the number, I think, was chosen. Don't hold me to this, but I think I read this, that the number was established, like how many bishops versus non-bishops are going to be there, so that if all of the bishops voted for a particular paragraph and all of the non-bishops voted against it, it would still pass. In other words, the bishops would still have enough of the 2/3 of the body to be able to approve a text.
Did they effectively do that?
They approved every paragraph. And the vast majority of them were all 354 to 1 or something like that, right? I mentioned the one that was, yeah, please.
Who actually wrote the final document?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there was a committee of people theologians, there were a couple of theologians and a couple of people who are on the Synod Secretariat, which is like the permanently established office of the Synod in Rome. So Cardinal Grech, who's the Maltese cardinal, who's the chair of it. But it's a good question. I don't know exactly if it was exactly those 4 or 5 people that I'm thinking of, but it was a small group of people. I would say the most important thing to know is that when the final text came back to the Synod, everybody said who was in the Synod, this is an accurate reflection of what we've talked about. Please.
How do we decide when they're having a Vatican Council versus the Synod or any other kind of governance?
Yeah, the Pope has to call an ecumenical council, which brings together all the bishops of the world. So the one in the 60s, from 1962 to 65, every bishop of the world was there. A synod is more representative. So many fewer people, not all bishops, right? So from the United States, I don't know, maybe there were 10 or 12 US bishops who were there, as opposed to the 370 of them or whatever that would go to an ecumenical council. But the Pope calls both, whether it's a synod or, but the synod, I mean, since the council has been kind of a mini council where they try to kind of recreate or continue the dynamic of what happened at the Ecumenical Council in the 1960s through these kind of smaller synods that would be an opportunity for the bishops of the world, a representative number of them, to get together with the Pope to talk about really important issues in the life of the Church. But now, for the first time, they're including non-bishops.
So would you expect for the decision to be made for women as deacons that they would have a Vatican Council agree, or not necessarily?
So the question is, like, would it require an ecumenical council to make a decision officially for or against women deacons? I don't think that will be the case. I think through this whole synod journey, we've seen that there's still so much more of the Vatican II theology and ecclesiology that has to be implemented before we think about calling another ecumenical council. And Pope Francis has said that periodically here and there. So he clearly sees this whole synodality thing as a part of that implementation. To the question of how the final decision on women deacons will be made, we don't know. If you were just to put me on the spot and ask me what my opinion is, I think that what the Synod has I didn't really touch on this, but one of the things the Synod final document has done and the whole experience has done is it has empowered local churches to assess their own pastoral needs and come up with their own pastoral solutions, including taking very serious questions like potentially ordaining women deacons and saying, we want to do this. We've discerned that this is a need and we want to do this in our local context, and they'll let Rome know, and Rome, I don't know. I mean, then there will be a conversation between, but I don't think that this will be imposed on the church. I think it will be something that comes up organically from local churches and then will be kind of signed off on and say, yeah, you're a local church that has every right to do that as long as you're maintaining unity with the rest of the church in matters of doctrine and faith. But if that's a pastoral decision that you discern, go for it. Yes?
You said earlier that there were women deacons in the church. What happened? Why did that change?
Good question. So the question is, why were there women deacons at one point in the history of the church, and then there suddenly were not? So you have to watch that video. But the short version is, it was a couple of things. So in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, there was a kind of heightened theology of the priesthood that started. So priests kind of became more central, more important, and there's a deepening of a kind of specialized theology of the priesthood that basically said, you have to be a man to be at the altar, and women were started to become seen as unclean because of menstrual cycles and other things. So there's all kinds of cultural, theological things that were happening around that time. And the truth about the history of women deacons is that they were not everywhere. So they were only in certain places. So it's very, I don't want to say inconclusive, but it was inconsistent in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, where there were women deacons and where there were not. Some churches felt the need to have them. Other churches, the bishop was like, absolutely not, that could never happen. So it wasn't some consistent practice that happened in the first part of and that's why historians even now, even the ones who are on the commission, sort of disagree about, were they actually ordained in the way that male deacons were ordained, and they weren't everywhere, so what does that mean, and that type of thing. So, but it was a kind of a excessive theology of the priesthood that started to emerge in the 11th and 12th century that I think is the biggest factor. Yeah, please.
I'm curious about, perhaps this is your opinion, but also just based on your knowledge of the Synod, do you think that wishful thinking, when women deacons are implemented, do you think this question of ordination is going to be a fixture? When you quoted Fernandez a few times, he was like, what do we need? What do we need an ordained minister for? So do you think that would be a stepping stone to women's ordination? Would it even be women's ordination to the diaconate, or would it be diaconal ministry, which is actually what paragraph 60 says? Curious about that.
This is my own take on it. I think Francis is very sensitive to clericalism and has an aversion to clericalism. He knows that clericalism has caused enormous problems throughout the church. And so I'm sort of putting my Pope Francis hat on here if I can, the white skull cap. I think that's part of the reason why he doesn't see clericalizing women as a solution right now. I think he's more interested in kind of redefining or reorienting the clergy as a ministry of service, right? Where he's talked in 2015, he gave a famous address about synodality where he talked about, we think of the hierarchy as a pyramid, but we really have to flip that down, because the people who are at the top are really at the bottom, who serve everybody else, right? So he's trying to kind of conceptualize what it actually means to have authority as an ordained minister in the church. And that's why I think he's tasked Cardinal Fernandez with kind of dismantling some of the things that we take for granted, that because you're ordained, you just have absolute power to make a decision in a parish, for example, or in a diocese. Like, yeah, of course, you can't, the church can't do something without the bishop being involved in the conversation, then you'd cease to be a Catholic communion. But the point is that just these things that we take for granted because we have this long history of clerical authority that Francis is saying, like, we had to break through that and recognize that because of all of our baptism, we already have enormous authority. And we have a right to say different things. And we have a right. Now, whether or not that solves the question of like the equality of men and women as we conceive of it in the church today, I don't know. But that's my sense of it. But will women, I guess you could say, like, if we restore women deacons, yes, they could be ordained the way like permanent male deacons are ordained, or maybe they're considered women deacons, but they're not ordained. I think if they're not ordained, then they're not deacons.
That's what I think too.
Like, you're either a deacon or you're not.
Or you're not. But the diaconal ministry piece, at least that was something that I was like, huh. Like, does that mean we're going to create a ministry for women that is like the diaconate?
I think that's possible. I think that's possible, but I feel like my opinion on that is like we're kind of twisting ourselves into a pretzel to avoid the fact that we just can't bring ourselves to ordain women as deacons. And I think that's silly, because even if you look at what the church teaches about holy orders, which is, right, you're ordained, there's 3 persons who are ordained: a bishop, a priest, and a deacon. And it's kind of always been this way. The bishop and the priest are ordained, the church teaches, in the person of Christ. And this has to do with, in particular, celebrating the Eucharist. The deacon is ordained to a ministry of service. So there's already a differentiation within the trifecta of ordination between the priest and the bishop and the deacon. So what's the problem with ordaining a woman as a deacon, as they were historically, to that ministry of service? Why does that somehow break people's minds when they have to think about, the unicity or the unity of the order, the sacrament of holy orders? That's a very legitimate question. One of the things I should say actually is that through this whole process, it kind of flew under the radar. With all the talk about study group 5 that I mentioned and these different study groups, Cardinal Grech, who's the head of the Synod, actually said publicly, I think it was on Instagram or something, on the Synod's Instagram page, he actually is welcoming people like us to send in their opinions about whether or not these things should happen. So if you have a strong opinion about, and you have some historical knowledge or theological knowledge about why something should be something or how we should be approaching this, the Synod office is actually welcoming that and will pass that information along to the different study groups. So I don't remember what the website is. You have to look it up, but please.
Sebastian, I just wanted to, first of all, that picture I find so disturbing because
This one?
it's entirely men.
If you look closely,
Is there a woman?
Sister Natalie Biccar is there. Yeah. There's one.
All right, that's good. But I find it, in the conversations that these people have, these men have, and all of that, what do they think that women, what's the detriment that women bring? What do they bring? I don't understand. So if we allow women to be deacons, how is that detrimental to the church? And,
You have to ask them.
does that question even come up with?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There were, so the way the Synod is, the rules around the Synod are such that the people inside are not allowed to kind of report to journalists or to us about who said what on the inside, because they're trying to create a safe space so that people can actually feel free to say what they want to say. But I can tell you from people I've spoken to off the record how incredible the women who are in the Synod were, how courageous they were in speaking up. A number of them talked about their vocations. There were so I know the picture, Natalie is sitting there and she's surrounded by men. So, I mean, yeah, we need an arrow there pointing at Sister Natalie. But I just want to acknowledge that, because the women who were the only women at their table for these 2 years and sat there listening to 9 men and then had to speak their piece did an incredible job of representing women. And everybody says that. So let me just go, because you already asked a question here in the minute.
So we've started the process of the Laudato Si climate action plan for the parish.
Yeah.
And we'd love it to be synodal, but it seems like a lot of work to make it synodal, whatever that is, And we're trying to get it done by May, so there's not a lot of time, actually. And everybody's always busy with other things. So any suggestions of how to make that work better?
Yeah, so the question is, if we're involved in some other kind of ministry, like your ministry is about Laudato Si and how to develop a plan for the parish, how do we kind of become synodal in our way of operating? So I pointed out a couple of paragraphs there where I thought the synod, here's a little hack with the final document. If you look through it quickly and you look for where there are sub-bullet points, like they're listing in bullet points, so not just a full paragraph, but there are bullet points where they say you should do this, you should do this, you should do this. Those tend to be the more kind of practical application proposals that they're making. So you can find those and read through them and see see how they might apply. But I think the process is pretty straightforward. I mean, you identify the question, you make sure people have an adequate amount of lead time to prepare. If you're a baptized person and you're on this committee and then you come unprepared for something, that's on you, and then you've failed the church in a small way, So we have to take some ownership here, right, of our own participation. There has to be room for prayer and quiet. That's one of the things that the Synod learned, and I think is very committed to now, is making that space. Everybody has to have a say, an equal say, and the key thing I think is. When you first go around the circle and everybody's talking, you cannot react or respond in the moment. The most detrimental thing to a synodal discernment process is giving in to immediate rebuttal. So you cannot allow that, right? And a lot of the delegates said over the course of these 2 years, they could tell that sometimes bishops were sitting there and they were just so antsy because they're so used to just saying what they think, and that's the word, and that goes. And here they are just sitting having to listen and listen and listen and listen. And so that exercise of listening is actually crucial for allowing space for the Holy Spirit to work. The last thing I'll say briefly is there's a wonderful resource coming out of England called the School for Synodality, or the School of Synodality. The woman's name is Avril Baigent, Baigent, and she was a facilitator at the Synod. We interviewed her on one of our podcasts, but she is excellent. And the resources that she's developed for actually how to do this at a parish is really good. So you can go there. Mark, yes?
To quote George Orwell's Animal Farm, some are more equal than others. I apologize for bringing up a topic from the last time we were here, but it seems to me that synodality and everything that is being spoken about, that a major impediment to that is the belief in the theology of ontological change. So, you can come here, lay people, you can come here, women, but we as priests are a superior class of being. You can come here, Protestant minister, and we'll even let you vote, but we, the priest, are a superior class of human being. I mean, at a certain point in time, that just becomes the ultimate white privilege, and it has to be, at some point, expunged.
Yeah.
If every priest, if the USCCB insisted that every priest in America preach about the meaning of ontological change, the pews would empty out. We can't ignore that as a stumbling block.
Yeah, and it's a really important point you raised, Mark, about the historical answer that I gave earlier about how did women deacons no longer. One of the, so this idea of there's an ontological change that happens when you're ordained to the priesthood, right? This kind of elaborate, kind of extraordinary, revolution that takes place in who you are as a person to make you this special vehicle of God's grace that you now have the power to bestow this. Like this heightened kind of understanding of the priesthood was part of that historical evolution. I mean, how do we undo it? I don't know, but the Synod is like very clear in articulating the power of every baptized person. And it says over and over and over again, we are all equal. Everybody has to be at the table of decision making. We're going to start to see some very practical things. I'm not saying you, Mark, but some of us are going to be called and be like, well, we need to have, the next Archbishop of Boston. What do you think? What do you need? What does the Archdiocese need? You have every right to give your opinion about that as Bishop X in the neighboring diocese. So stuff like that is going to start happening. And I think what's really important is like that lay people kind of step up and step into their own baptismal call in order for the priest to say and see, these people know what they're doing and they know what they're talking about and they're willing to, take on this responsibility so it's not all on me. And I think a lot of priests are actually willing to go there,
I'm fine with incrementalism, and we've always had simultaneously the theology of sensum fidelium.
Yes.
That Benedict would have liked to have gotten rid of. Again, I think there needs to be some real acknowledgement that this is potentially a separation of classes of human being that doesn't fit in today's society.
Maybe without addressing it so directly, I think the Synod does do that. Like the statements in there about the equality of all the baptized, the people of God on the journey together, the bishop being amidst the people and one of the people, Francis saying, this document is our document, it's not my document, I don't need to write my own document. There's all these little signs of understanding what Vatican II called, the church is the people of God on the journey and not the hierarchy, which comes much later. Please.
We didn't touch on it, but I know the LGBTQ community going into the synodal process, I think, had a lot of expectations and hopes, and at least some of the reporting in your magazine would indicate that a lot of that community is very disappointed. And I know Jim Mark has written an awful lot about this in the magazine, but what's your assessment of, should they be disappointed?
I'm not from that community, so I don't want to say what they should or shouldn't feel. I'll read here just the quote that is a reference to that community. So the question was, how should the LGBTQ plus community feel about the Synod experience in the final document? So this is in paragraph 50 under the headline New Relationships, and it says, what emerged throughout the entire synodal journey and in every place and in every context was the call for a church with a greater capacity to nurture relationships with the Lord, between men and women, in the family and local communities, among social groups and religions, with all of creation. Many participants were delighted and surprised to be asked to share their thoughts and to be given the opportunity to have their voices heard in the community. Others continue to express the pain of feeling excluded or judged because of their marital status, identity, or sexuality. The desire for more real and meaningful relationships is not only a longing to belong to a close-knit group, but may also reflect a deep sense of faith. And it goes on. So, the only kind of reference to the community that you're talking about is an acknowledgement that there's a lot more work to be done in the final document. So, in terms of you mentioned Jim Martin, my colleague, who runs an outreach ministry that ministers to LGBTQ community. I think he's very happy with the thing. If you read what he's written about the experience, I think he'll tell you this was an extraordinary moment, and everybody who's part of the LGBTQ community who are baptized have every right to be at the table, just like any of the rest of us. There's no differentiation when it comes to baptism, and that's what's been highlighted by the Synod. So, other thoughts? Oh, please, back here.
Parallel between Catholic Church and the Synod.
And the what, sorry?
Church and the science.
And the what?
So the battle between scientists.
Between scientists?
Yeah, isn't there scientists some other lay people in there?
Were there scientists there? I don't know, actually. It's a good question. I know there were, there were theologians, there were some social scientists. So it probably depends on what types of scientists you were talking about. But I think, no, the people who are kind of peripheral inside the synod, who are like experts and facilitators, I don't know of any scientists who were there. No. Okay, we have a question online. Married priests. This conversation is happening with one objection being keeping a priest in the same location sorry, Scott, I can't read this. To raise children. Is this necessary or is this a false delay? I'm not sure, do you understand what the question is? So the first part, married priests. I don't think that came up in the synod. And if it was, it wasn't discussed in the final document, I don't believe. But I think it's the question of married priests, though, is a question of discipline, not doctrine. So it can be changed because there's a long period of the church, like women deacons, where priests were married. And we have married priests in the Catholic Church. So like we have, for example, former Anglican priests who convert to Catholicism and continue to exercise their priestly ministry, can bring their family and their wives with them. This is one of those things where I think the onus is now on the local church to discern the pastoral need or the change and then do it. So this is I don't know if the local churches will find the courage to do some of those things, but I think the onus is on them to do it now. I think the Pope has through this synod process and through what the final document has said and discerned about the importance of the local church related to the universal church and the power that they have to discern their own pastoral needs, it's on them to make that proposal. I know we have a little bit more time. Other questions, please, again?
I was at the synod the first week.
Okay.
With a couple of church reform organizations. And I'm curious, kind of in your positionality, like as somebody who's covering the synod, do you find that reform organizations are heard by people on the other side of the synod walls? Or are we there just kind of like throwing our own party? That's like a personal, curious question. Like, because I had a great time, but I was with like-minded people.
Right.
And I felt really empowered by our activism.
Yeah.
And some of the work that I was doing was in the final document in paragraph 60. But I'm just curious, like, from that more like, internal perspective, like, is that work important in your opinion?
Yeah. So the question is like, there's a number of kind of advocacy groups for different causes that are around the synod. So when something like a synod happens, naturally you have groups of people who are advocating for one issue or another show up in Rome to try to kind of make their case, right? So what group were you with?
I was with Future Church.
You were with Future Church. Okay, Future Church was there. I went to an event that Discerning Deacons was putting on, so they were well represented, and they actually had a contingent who met with Pope Francis, where a number of the women who are part of the Discerning Deacons process actually shared their vocation stories with Pope Francis and talked to him about that, and he listened. So the question is, like, is that important? Is it recognized, like, from within the synod? I think yes. I think not publicly. I think there's still a little bit of hesitation, suspicion, right, of these people who are just advocating for one issue, and there's a clear sense from the Vatican and from officials at the synod that, especially around this synod, to ensure that the synod didn't become about one thing. I spent a lot of time talking about women deacons because, again, like I said, I think it's one of the most mature questions. So I think we have to focus on it, and it touches on the question of women, which is probably the central question of the whole synod. But the synod itself, like the people who are running the synod and the Pope, doesn't want it to become about any one issue. Is it still important for those groups to come and voice your opinion? Absolutely.
Sebastian, do you know what Olivia was rattle-rousing for? What important cause? Share Olivia.
Oh, sure. We did a lectionary project to include hidden women from the
Yeah, let me read
Our
it.
campaign was called Mary Magdalene Goes to the Synod. And in paragraph 60, it says, there are women in the scriptures who are central to our experience, I'm paraphrasing, as Christians, and we believe that their story should be told in our Sunday lectionaries. And they mention, I shouldn't say he, they mention Mary Magdalene by name, which is exciting.
That's right.
And now that Pope Francis has said this is certified Catholic magisterium, hopefully it happens. But this is not about it.
At the very end of that paragraph, too, which is worth quoting, the Synod says, "The Assembly asks that more attention be given to the language and images used in preaching, teaching, catechesis, and the drafting of official church documents, giving more space to the contributions of female saints, theologians, and mystics." So it's clearly a lack that needs to be, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Please.
I don't remember it, forgive me for this, but was one of the key sins that Pope Francis wanted enunciated sins against women?
Yes.
I'd like to pause there.
Yes. The question or the comment was one of the sins at the penitential service was confessing the sin against women in the church. And that was one of them, yes. So we just wanted to pause and give that time. Betty Ann, please.
I've resisted, but I have to ask.
Yes, of course.
There are so many Catholics, probably around the world, but I'll just speak about the United States, who in their parishes didn't even have pre-meetings that this was going to occur. And many of them are also in parishes where their pastors are not inclined to get involved this way because it's not a part of their day-to-day concerns, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens, what has been put into place, or how do people move forward when they recognize that as baptized members of the church, there's an equality with their pastor, their bishop, and ultimately the Pope? How do we move forward when there is not an inclination to do that? Do you just start meeting in your homes and invite the parishioners and then create some sort of civil unrest in the church? I mean, I'm not looking for a schism here, but
Yeah.
seriously, I am a hopeful person and I want to believe this will trickle down.
Yeah.
Will it? And when? I'll be dead.
So the question passionately expressed was, what do we do if you're interested in trying to live this synodality thing and the people around you in your parish or the bishop, the local bishop, is not interested in this?
Exactly.
And so it becomes very difficult. Do you go out on your own, become kind of a lone ranger, create all kinds of tension? I mean, the answer is maybe. I think like the Synod has said categorically, this is the way of the future. Yeah. It's the way of the present, and it's the way of the future. This is now, we have experienced this to a degree that we can say confidently that this is now part of our DNA. Every structure that we have, every relationship that we have, every decision that we make needs to be done in this way. So those people have all become convinced of that. So I use the analogy like the internet. You know, when the internet came, it was like this revolutionary thing. And you either kind of learned how to use the internet or you'd be left behind. And synodality is like that in the church, where it's becoming just the water that we swim in, and you're either going to learn how to swim or you're going to drown. So, you know, that's why I say that like the launching pad versus the landing strip, you have to kind of put this in perspective. And I know it's hard because many people in the church have seen moments of grace and what's the word? Not influence. What am I trying to say? Inspiration, moments of grace, moments of inspiration, and been really, you know, inspired to do it, to want to take that and run with it, only to be disappointed, only to be disappointed, only to be disappointed. But this is like such a widespread thing now. It's not just a few people in the church here and there. It's the entire representative body of the Catholic Church around the world. So two answers for you. One is, yes, I think you should start on your own. If you, like, not by yourself, you have to try to find a few like-minded people. And luckily at St. Cecilia, you have a lot of people. You probably have too many people. No, you can't have too many people. Everybody is welcome, right? But yeah, that's what you have to do. You no longer have to ask permission to do this. The permission is in the final document, which is part of the ordinary magisterium of the teaching of the magisterium of the Church and of the Pope, and it's the voice of the Synod, which is representative of the entire Church around the world. So you can confidently, I mean, it might be a little bit fearful, and maybe you ruffle a few feathers, but you have to say, no, this is the way we're doing this now. This is not something that I've invented because I have a particular issue I want to push. So, but the key thing is to lead with the process and not the issue. One of the things in the points I mentioned back here is so important. Point C, when you're dealing with a question or you're trying to do the synod stuff, an inner disposition of freedom regarding one's own interests, both personal and as a group, and a commitment to the pursuit of the common good. So we all have our particular issues that we want to, I want to have a synod because I want X. I want women deacons, but if you're really going to do the synod thing honestly, you have to work really hard to put that aside and, so in other words, push the process and the synod, not the issue. And if you can free yourself from that, you'll learn a lot about yourself, you'll learn a lot about the community, and you don't know what's going to happen. Leave room for the Holy Spirit. The second thing I want to say briefly, I know Scott's, I got to wrap this up. One of the things that's lacking from the final document, and we do not have, is mechanisms of recourse when this is not being done. So the Synod is saying lovely things about how now bishops need to account for whether or not they're doing this, but how and to whom, And if I'm a person who wants to do, or we're a group of people who wants to do something synodal in the parish, and the priest vetoes it, and it dies, what recourse do we have as a group to hold them responsible? We don't know that yet. So it's not a cop-out, I promise, but launching pad, not the landing strip. So, but those are the types of questions that now can come up. Like we're starting to see through this document, very practical things, infrastructure to build those structures of accountability and evaluation. Like those are now starting to be put in place. So if we're like, okay, well, we need to have some kind of recourse when this doesn't happen, we should say that. And we should try to create those, Are we at time, Scott? Oh, another couple of questions online. Why didn't the U.S. bishops engage wholeheartedly with the pre-synod work? Does this reluctance not prove inhibitive to synodality in the U.S. Church? You have to be, not all bishops were not wholeheartedly into the pre-synodal thing. There were bishops who took this very seriously and did amazing work. I actually thought, too, the work of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and how they organized the different regional conversations, led by Bishop Dan Flores, who's from Brownsville, Texas, and other very good lay people that work in that office. They, I thought, did an excellent job, for the most part, in trying to kind of mobilize the church across the United States to participate in this. But you do have a number of bishops who were less enthusiastic about the whole thing, who chose not to talk about it, or who paid lip service to it. I won't name names, but I know there were some dioceses where they would actually have listening sessions, and the bishop would take the findings or the reports from the different groups that were consulted, and then draft or redact a completely different thing that was then sent to Rome. So that is totally unacceptable, totally unsynodal, and needs to be named for what it is. But we have remember Sister Natalie Bicard's comment about the Roman Curia. Even the Roman Curia has to learn how to be synodal, right? So, and maybe back to Mark's point, maybe especially the hierarchy has to learn how to be synodal, if you come from a position of less power, and I, as a man in the church, I'm not one of those people. I have quite a bit of power actually, but I know like if you come from a community that has less power, you're very conscious of all the ways you have to navigate the world in order to get anything done, right? And so that type of realization needs to happen at the highest levels of the church. I don't know if it will, but Francis, as he said today in his note, there's no excuse. This has to be implemented. We're expecting a report back when you come for your visit to Rome every couple of years to get a full accounting of what you're doing and what you're not and why you're not doing something. One of the things in the final document that's really important too is when a decision has been discerned. So let's say we all decide we want a different coffee that's made. No, coffee's great. If a priest or an authority, a bishop, says, no, I hear you, but we're not doing that, he has to give an account to the community as to why he made that decision or why he didn't make that decision. So that's now required according to the Synod. So, there's little mechanisms for accountability that are being offered here that need to be studied, learned, implemented. I think if you're a person without power in the church, you're no longer helpless. You now have the beginning of an infrastructure around you to help you participate in a more meaningful way and to make sure that your voice will be heard. Last question here online. How is synodality becoming a priority within the USCCB? They just had their annual meeting in Baltimore in early November. They did request a special committee to be established to make sure that this is being implemented. It's a little bit early, TBD, right? We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but that's a very promising sign. So I'm hopeful. I just think, that phrase, the toothpaste is out of the tube. I think this is one of those situations. Many people at the Synod in Rome said there's no going back. So that's a hopeful sign. Last final thoughts or questions? Please, very quickly.
I just want to plead that when women are finally ordained, that they not be required to take a vow of celibacy.
I'll find the website to the Vatican for feedback, and we can send that to them. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here, for participating. I love coming back to St. Cecilia. I love your community. And just a word of encouragement, like St. Cecilia is the type of place where there's so much dynamism already that the church needs you and the people watching online who are part of the far-flung flock and beyond to be leaders in implementing this whole thing, right? So, the other parishes that are not as dynamic, that don't have as, we need places like you to lead. So please step up and recognize your own baptismal call. Thank you.